You know what's funny? Whenever a video title is phrased as a question, there's always inevitably a couple people who immediately comment a single word answer and nothing else, as if the video itself is asking the question, rather than endeavoring to answer the question. Just for the record, by the way, as far as answering this question, I'm going to be bouncing back and forth to both sides of the fence before the end of the video, so just hear me out. Just Cause, a series for which the phrase anarchic chaos was practically coined. During a time when cinematic and linear were as synonymous with the gaming industry as the phrase moral panic, Just Cause sought to reinvent the wheel by hitting upon the surprisingly novel concept of making a series built around total freedom. Destruction and chaos were the name of the game, and they built everything around the act of blowing shit up. It's a great series, with Just Cause 2 and 3 being among some of my favorite games of all time. As a matter of fact, I was making a list of my favorite games of every year from 1981 to the modern day, and when it came to 2010, I had to choose between Just Cause 2 or God of War 3, both of which happen to be two of my favorite games of all time. It felt like a hostage situation. Just Cause 4, on the other hand, well, we don't talk about that one. But last time when we talked about Just Cause and I discussed how 4 essentially ruins everything the series is known for and suggested ways to bring it back to its former glory, one topic that kept coming up in the comment section almost as much as the people telling me that Just Cause 3 already had a jetpack wingsuit, I heard you the first 200 times guys, was to include multiplayer in future releases as a means to fix the series' current direction. This is a topic that's pretty much followed the Just Cause series for as long as I've been a fan, the idea of having an officially supported multiplayer mode. Just Cause, as you'll know, has been staunchly single player since day one, even in the era where every game had a tacked on multiplayer mode. Did you know Saints Row 2 had an arena multiplayer mode? Yeah. So it makes sense that in an era where multiplayer is almost compulsory, this is something that would be a big request. But Avalanche has always stuck to their guns and made the games fully single player, except for having leaderboards that you can't turn off, and man, I wish you could. Back in 2014, in the run-up to Just Cause 3's release, I remember seeing a comment on a Facebook post on the official Just Cause page that went something along the lines of, "Single player is dead. Multiplayer is the way of the future. Nobody plays single player games anymore. If you want your games to succeed, you'll have to add multiplayer." That comment kind of always stuck with me, mostly because it pissed me off so much back then, because that was back when I was extremely against the idea of multiplayer modes in single player games. I believed that all games had to stand up on their single player mode alone because there are factors you can't account for if you focus all your efforts on multiplayer as well, such as the multiplayer mode simply dying. Tacked-on multiplayer modes in single-player games have traditionally died out very quickly once the novelty wears off. Once that happens, people usually gravitate back towards the multiplayer game they enjoy the most. When I was growing up, that was the multiplayer modes in whatever Call of Duty was out, and eventually GTA 5. I played the multiplayer mode in Red Faction Guerrilla a couple times, but me and my friends never stuck around. And what happens when a multiplayer mode dies? Well, you basically just pointlessly wasted a bunch of resources on something you could have put into something else, preferably the evergreen aspects of the game. And that's what I respected about the Just Cause series back then especially, was that it didn't compromise its vision by diverting resources into separate gameplay modes and missions that wouldn't benefit the core experience. It was a series that zhuzhed up its single-player mode first and foremost, so with that, Just Cause to me is an inherently single-player experience, and they've always put maximum effort into making this as fun as possible for the solo gamer. I mean, considering they've resisted adding a multiplayer mode option whatsoever, kind of already spells this out for you. So you'd be risking diverting resources away from making the core experience as fun as possible to make a completely separate mode. Potentially risking making a thoroughly mediocre experience for everyone rather than being a good multiplayer game or a good single-player game. You see, because while I've lightened up on the idea of multiplayer games these days, I still believe that you can make a good single-player game or a good multiplayer game, but it's extremely rare for a game to hold up as well for both single and multiplayer. Inevitably, one's going to get more focus and be the better experience. From a developer's point of view, it might not even become clear which is the better experience until you've already finished the game, so even if you deliberately put equal amounts of time and effort into both, it's no guarantee that they'll be equally as good. And quite frankly, people who want single-player experiences want different things to what people who only play multiplayer want. If you try and go for both demographics, it's exceedingly rare that you can please both. And that's kind of my main hang-up with the idea. Yeah, the series needs to move away from what it was in Just Cause 4 and get back on track, but simply adding multiplayer in itself is not necessarily a solution because that doesn't guarantee a positive experience. It also doesn't guarantee a long-term success or better quality. It's not a one-size-fits-all path to immediate success and critical acclaim that some people make it out to be. It's a broad overall concept that needs the right game in order to work. It's one of those things that can go either way if you're not careful. Additionally, it has the potential to backfire. When you have a previously single-player series, there's a risk in making it multiplayer. You risk going too far in that direction and alienating the primary fanbase, the fanbase that had built the series' profile up to that point. And if you go all in on alienating your primary fanbase in favor of a potential audience, there's a real possibility that the risk doesn't end up paying off, and you end up in a situation where you're worse off than you would have been if you would have just stuck to your guns. Plus, because Avalanche Studios have always been single-player focused first and foremost, by insisting they cram in a multiplayer mode, you could very well be asking them to make something that's completely out of their wheelhouse. And as various subsidiaries of EA have shown time and again, having a studio make something they're not familiar with is a good way to make a thoroughly mediocre game. But as much as I could present counter-arguments to the idea of Just Cause going multiplayer, there's also a pretty hefty monkey wrench in this whole discussion in favor of it. Both Just Cause 2 and 3 famously have multiplayer mods that were extremely popular for their time. In fact, the multiplayer mods are so entrenched with these games' identities that Just Cause 2, when I purchased it on Steam, came with the multiplayer mod already included. At least it did when I bought it, so it proves there is a large audience for this, and one that Square Enix is willing to support at least tacitly, because otherwise the mod would have not come with the game. As a matter of fact, I remember when the Just Cause 2 multiplayer mod went into beta, it was all over YouTube. I was seeing video after video after video about it. And it did look incredibly fun, so I guess that also raises the question, does an official multiplayer mode even really need to be made when the fans have already proven themselves ready, willing, and able to pick up on that particular bit of slack? Should Avalanche and Square Enix divert resources away from making the game as fun as possible as a single-player game, or simply just give the blessing to the mods? Well, I guess that's up to your own discretion. That does also raise some other issues, such as it only being available on PC, that wouldn't work for people playing on console. But then again, they could very well just license out the mod or buy it outright. So am I saying that a Just Cause multiplayer couldn't work? Jesus no, because multiplayer Just Cause has already proven itself to work to some degree, and it's proven itself to be popular. Despite the fact that Avalanche has always built these games as single-player experiences from the ground up, it's not something that as a concept can't be translated into multiplayer without losing the core tenets of its identity, in theory. I think linear story-based games are the type of genre that attacked on multiplayer mode hurts the most, but with a game based around spectacle and minimal story, something that definitely defined the Just Cause series at least before 4, you could make a full-on multiplayer mode work as these mods have proven, but to what degree could it work, and in what way? Could you make an expansive multiplayer mode exist harmoniously alongside an equally expansive single-player mode without one being at the expense of the other? Those are the million-dollar questions. Questions that I don't really have the answer to, and nobody really would unless it happened. But do I think there's a way to reconcile the two chunks of the fanbase without risking either one? Well, that I do have an answer to. I think that it would be smart for them, whether it be Avalanche or another company filling in, to make an entirely separate standalone Just Cause multiplayer game. Because then you can focus on completely different things. Let the different styles play to their own strengths. I mean, this has been slightly lost to history, but it's kinda like how Fortnite Battle Royale was a free-to-play spin-off of a completely separate game. It just so happened to completely take over the world. It wasn't the core by which the game was made, so I think it would be great to make something along the lines of Call of Duty Warzone, Genshin Impact, or Apex Legends, but for Just Cause. Because then you can deliberately structure the experience to where it's fully entrenched in the multiplayer mindset. It's balanced for that. The gameplay is built towards that. I would even go as far as to suggest they make it a free-to-play game. If modern-day audiences have taught me anything, it's that the modern free-to-play model has proven successful for a lot of studios. The examples I gave have all been well received, and you can have a monetization model that benefits long-term play rather than relying on a one-time purchase. Free-to-play isn't something that I personally care for. In fact, I personally find a lot of the free-to-play thing to be insidious, but if you play a free-to-play game, that's what you're signing up for. so I probably wouldn't play it, but a free Just Cause multiplayer game would probably do gangbusters among the fanbase and beyond without necessarily harming the mainline games. I would hope, anyway. It can be competitive, or it can be large-scale cooperative. Have the points be based around who destroys structures as well as killing other players. Or make it a free roam, maybe just have a bunch of things to destroy and servers with hundreds of people on them. The other option that I think could reconcile both people who want multiplayer and people who don't is by having a separate mode made after the game is completed. Similar to things like Ghost of Tsushima Legends mode or The Last of Us Factions. These were cases where the games they were based on were finished products, and only once everything was said and done did they really go headlong into making a large-scale separate mode. At least that way, the core experience is completed as intended and you're not focusing on multiplayer until the base game is already completed. So if people want to play the multiplayer mode, they get it, but for those who just want to play the single player mode, they're not getting gypped. Assuming the game's mechanics lend themselves to multiplayer at all, which theoretically Just Cause's mechanics could. But that's all working under the assumption that it's going to be a competitive Just Cause multiplayer game, and that it would be either a separate game or a completely separate mode from the main game. That doesn't also take into account the concept of a co-op Just Cause game. It's easy to just say, make a standalone free-to-play multiplayer mode or multiplayer mode made after the main game is finished, because things like that have proven themselves to be lucrative and not reductive to the mainline entries in these games. But co-op is something that needs to be integrated into the formula from the ground up. Having a game be balanced to where it can be played by one person or two people simultaneously is not something that can just be thrown in as an afterthought and still have it be worth the effort. You gotta think about balance, how to allocate content exclusive to single player or content exclusive to multiplayer, if you intend to have the game be played by a single player or two people from the perspective of the story in the world, or if it's gonna alter the story in any way. You know, like, for example, will the characters in the world be referring to you by plural pronouns because they expect there to be more than one person? What benefit does the existence of a co-op mode have other than being a co-op mode? These are the questions you have to ask. Do I think a co-op mode could work? Well, theoretically, anything can work, it's just about how well you pull it off. I think the latter-day Saints Row games are a good example of this, wherein you have games that can work as both a single-player game and a co-op experience. I've played Saints Row games on both, and I think they are a rare case where the single player and co-op are both, if not equally fun, at least relatively equally focused on. And those are sandbox games built to be over the top and wacky, something that Just Cause can claim to be as well, if not quite as over the top, if you can believe that. So in that regard, I think it can absolutely work so long as they match a similar progression system to the second and third games, as Anarchy with Friends has proven itself to be a more enjoyable experience than doing some linear mission structure. Although that applies to single-player games as well, but specifically with Friends, something where you can just mess around for hours on end is always a good time. You're not going to be as immersed in a story or overcomplicated gameplay loops if you're riffing with your friends. You want something simple and easy to get into with very little distracting you from the fun elements, so I think that a two-player co-op mode in Just Cause could easily work so long as they balance it correctly for single and multiplayer. I remember seeing another comment on Facebook all those years ago, and for the record, isn't it cute to imagine a time when people used Facebook, where they said that you could just add a couple of co-op missions, and you don't need to do anything big. I disagree, because if you're gonna put multiplayer in a game, you might as well commit to it. As much as I am against half-assing a game and using multiplayer as an excuse, I'm just as against tacking on a half-assed multiplayer mode that's included just for the sake of appeasing the audience that wants multiplayer. So to answer the broad overall question, do I think that multiplayer could work in the Just Cause series? Well, there's no reason it couldn't, and there's already proof in that particular pudding that it could work and that people would like it. Do I think it needs multiplayer? Not necessarily, but if that's what people want, then I see no reason why they couldn't at least try it out. The real question is, what defines need in this case? Does something really need to justify its existence in any other way other than simply being fun? Well, that's the question, isn't it? So if a majority of fans are on board with something, then I guess that's what the series needs. And I've seen with my own two eyes that it's a big request. But do I want multiplayer? Well, here's what it comes down to. I've been a fan of Just Cause since 2010, and the last thing I want is for the experience to suffer, for these games to become forgettable or worse. So as long as they can make it in such a way that it doesn't harm the experience that the series is known for traditionally, or at the very least make it a standalone product made separate from the mainline games, then they can do whatever the hell they want, even if I don't necessarily want it. But I'm a little bit iffy, as shifting focus in traditionally single-player franchises tends to lead to a downturn in quality from my observation. The objective side of me wants the series to have what will make it the most successful, but the selfish part of me doesn't want something that could potentially alienate me and the player base that prefers games be a solitary process, completely change the appeal of the franchise, or use a multiplayer mode to justify half-assing the rest of the game, which is not unheard of. But then again, it's not like you could do much worse than Just Cause 4 at this point, which I remind you was a fine enough game, but one that completely removes a lot of what made the series unique and fun. So for the things that I come to Just Cause 4, no pun intended, there's really no way to go but up for the next game. Well, I say that. So to separate my own personal feelings from this matter, what the series needs is whatever will make it more fun and more successful than ever. And in many people's eyes, that is multiplayer, so who am I to argue? It's never going to be as simple as a yes or a no when it comes to an alteration like this, but contrary to what I might have said back in the day, it's not something that couldn't work or shouldn't happen. But it's definitely something that needs to be implemented correctly. Talk about a completely non-committed take. If you like what I do and want to support the channel financially, please consider pledging to my Patreon for unique perks and rewards such as exclusive content, early access, and exclusive Discord benefits like these people here. And an extra special thank you to FarmCat84 and GAW004 for going above and beyond. Otherwise, you can support the channel by liking this video, subscribing, and hitting the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. Elsewise than that, I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Peace!